My name is Kelly Urick. I'm a senior program manager here at Fourth, and I'll be moderating our panel today. Again, it's titled Connections to the Grid, Utilities and Their Role in Transportation Electrification. I manage programs at Fourth that seek to increase access to and the adoption of electric vehicles. From car sharing to workplace charging, my programs would not be successful without robust partnerships with local partners and, of course, electric utilities. Utilities have a direct relationship with individual consumers and organizations, and thus have a really important role to play in transportation electrification. They can help educate their customers about the benefits of adopting electric vehicles and be a trusted resource for technical information about electricity and support in identifying charging solutions. Utilities are also uniquely positioned to ensure that any investments they make in charging infrastructure or incentive programs, for example, are designed to benefit all customers. I'm getting a little bit of feedback from Jacqueline. Thank you, Jacqueline. All right, so I'm joined today by a really great selection of panelists, and we're going to start. I'll introduce each panelist. They're going to give a few opening remarks, and then we'll do a Q&A after that. So I'd like to introduce our first panelist. Maria Bocanegra is a commissioner with the Illinois Commerce Commission. She currently serves as the national chair for the NARUC's EV Working Group, as co-chair for the World Research Institute's Electric School Bus Advisory Council, as well as a member of the National EV Charging Initiatives Advisory Council. She's also a member of the Department of Energy's Industry Steering Committee for its Voices of Experience series on electrification. Thanks for joining us today, Maria, and I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. I'm looking at the chat here, and it's so great to see folks I know, organizations I know, and some folks from Chicago like me. So welcome, everybody. I'm really looking forward to this discussion, especially being someone from Illinois. I'm very proud to say that approximately 2 months ago, Governor Pritzker enacted sweeping energy legislation that I'll share with you a little bit about today, and exactly how that impacts the role of our regulated utilities as we look towards electrifying our transportation sectors in a more equitable way. So I'll start with what we have been doing in Illinois, and then I will go into what the National EV Working Group has been up to in the coming months, and then I'll highlight a couple of cases, if you will, that I think touch on the expanding role of our utilities when we talk about the intersection of equity and transportation electrification. So like I said, we recently enacted sweeping clean energy legislation. It's about 1,000 pages long, so we're still all sifting through it. But I want to start by saying that, this piece of legislation is really rooted in all things equity. There's a variety of programs in there that not just focus on the utility role or even my agency's role, but certainly things like our EPA, our DCEO, but collaboratively and together, I think the bedrock of that legislation really is equity focused. And to give you some examples, in a lot of this legislation, there is definitions that are expanded on, and these apply equally across all of the agencies that will be impacted by this legislation. And so to give you an example of some of these definitions that will permeate everything that the utility role will have when we talk about electrification, we have definitions now for equity eligible contractors, equity eligible communities, equity focused populations. There are definitions for eligible persons, equity investment eligible people, eligible communities, so on and so forth. We even have definitions for disadvantaged workers. And I think that, as we talk a little bit more about this legislation, you'll see that really the utility role is expanding significantly with an eye towards ensuring that a lot of these communities and people are accounted for as we electrify our sector. our transportation sector. So one piece of the new legislation focuses on financial access to investing in clean energy. And this can be anybody in the EV ecosystem, if you will, that will eventually be impacted by our utilities electrification plans. We have a board of directors that will be set up, all of which have to be everything from diverse, have experience working with low income or environmental justice communities. We also will have a bureau on apprenticeship programs and clean energy jobs. I know that Jacqueline's also on the panel today. I know she's going to talk more about workforce, but similarly, you'll see that a lot of these bureaus and programs all align itself with our utilities' new expanded role. One interesting thing that Illinois has enacted is we are moving toward multi-year integrated grid distribution planning. And so that is a more holistic approach to grid, optimizing the grid and planning for years out. But it also includes asking our utilities to really think about how electric vehicle adoption can be supported through integrated grid planning, including beneficial electrification. And included in that is also the mandate that they look at how they can help achieve some of these equity goals that are embedded in a lot of this legislation. Interestingly, the multi-year integrated grid plan, although, like I said, it's more holistic, it does require that a lot of these efforts bring at least 40% of these benefits to equity investment eligible communities. So that's not a mandate on a specific amount of spend, but it is a percentage spend that I think will be interesting to see how we explore. I think the biggest bedrock and what we're all here to talk about is electrification. And so Illinois, for the first time now, is requiring its electric utilities to file beneficial electrification programs. So they're similar in nature to what we see in other jurisdictions, other commissions, other utilities, except again, I think that ours has a real equity-focused lens at which we're asking our utilities not only to develop the stakeholder engagement workshops. So from the very beginning, that really is another foundational element to these programs, but it's also implementation and metrics and tracking. And so just to give you a highlight of what is going to be required, the portfolio of these programs can include everything from low-income programs that provide access to electric vehicles in communities where car ownership or even new car ownership is not common. There's incentives that are focused just for eligible communities. Likewise, there is incentives or programs that can enable quicker adoption in these same types of communities. Equally important, in my opinion, is I know Chicago gets a lot of the attention when we think about Illinois, but there's also incentive and programs around more rural areas who also, oftentimes might get left out of the equity conversation, but it's important that downstate Illinois be considered. And so there is a mandate for programs in those types of areas. In addition, there is a mandate that there is support offered to these low-income communities who are experiencing financial and accessibility barriers such that ownership may not be an option. Again, it goes on to define a lot of the phrases that we've talked about. So there is a process. Essentially, these plans have to be filed by the middle of next year, and the commission, we will go through them. And the mandate for regulators now is we now have to evaluate it through a different lens. We have to make sure that they're investing in everything from, for example, level 2 fast charging stations, et cetera, in workplaces and eligible communities. In addition, we also have to make sure that, again, some of these investments, where appropriate, are being invested in rural areas. The other thing that, the standard, if you will, for regulators is that we have to make sure it's in the public interest. But the statute's very clear now that it will be determined that it will be in the public interest if we can also find through those docketed proceedings that environmental justice interests are in fact being addressed. Either directly participating in some of these programs and or benefiting from some of these programs. Again, at least 40% of these investments have to be make-ready infrastructure. In addition, There's review processes, and of course the metrics, like I mentioned, they have to track everything from workforce equity actions, where they are spending, with whom they're contracting, whether these businesses are enterprises for minorities, women's, persons with disabilities, or any other certification under a variety of state, local, and even federal laws. So that's just a snapshot, but I think the takeaway is, as you can see, the new legislation really expands the role, in my opinion, of what we're asking our utilities to do. And so the one thing I will share, in my opinion, and this is a conversation we have a lot of, I think that as we ask the role of our utilities to evolve, I think it's equally important that regulation also evolve to meet those challenges and meet those demands. A couple other highlights where I think that the utility role is expanding when we talk about electrification and equity. We're also moving towards performance-based rate making. Again, improvements in everything from reliability to resiliency, with an emphasis in disadvantaged areas. Supplier diversity reporting is going to be expanded. More recently, actually yesterday, Governor Pritzker signed additional legislation, and this is more on the economic development side, really encouraging electric vehicle ecosystem manufacturers to relocate here to Illinois. But I think what's interesting is, one of the bedrocks of that new piece of legislation is there are bigger incentives for facilities that are located in underserved areas of our state. And so even though that doesn't necessarily implicate our utilities, I guess my point is that a lot of this legislation is very complementary to the overall policy objectives of not only our state, but what it is we're asking manufacturers and utilities to do. Now, I told you I'd talk a little bit about the EV working group. That's comprised of about 26 states. And so we all get together monthly and talk about some of the electrification related trends that we're seeing in our commissions, or just issues that we're tackling. And so just to give you a snapshot of what's been going on a national level with utilities, utility filings. So over the past year, utility incentives are the most common enacted policy to promote EVs, followed by EV charging rates. There's about 10 states with pending filings, either updating that or enacting that. I think that this is, really demonstrative again of the prominence of utility incentives and rate design, and shows how instrumental not just utilities but commissions are at driving and regulating EV policy and implementation. Going on to some of the other trends we're seeing, I think you guys are probably very familiar with these, but some of the big trends that continue are rebates, cash vouchers, equity groups having more participation, and also, pairing that with other state level incentives, whether it be HOV lane access, tax credits, free or reduced parking. So that continues to be a big trend. As far as the working group is, some of you may be familiar. In 2019, the working group published a paper, and I'm happy to share that in the chat. That's actually going to be updated this year. And one of the updates is a focus on equity. And so if you guys want to share anything about what you're seeing in other commissions, feel free to share that with me. We'd love to put that into the new white paper. We're also going to be doing a mini guide for state agencies and what their roles are when we talk about electric vehicles. And that's going to involve interviewing folks from different commissions and even different departments of transportation. I already mentioned, there's going to be an equity addendum to this issue brief. The plan is to look at utility transportation electrification plans. Like I said, that continues to be the big filing that we see across commissions. And we're also going to be doing a roundtable on equity and energy justice, along with the organizations NGA and NASIO sometime in April of next year. So be on the lookout for that. And lastly, I'll just highlight a couple of state programs where utilities are filing in front of commissions, and a little bit of the distinction that you see between how equity is being handled. So in North Carolina, they just approved some pilot programs for Duke Energy. In that, a couple takeaways. Pilots continue to be looked at with great scrutiny. Evaluation and metrics are also evolving. Again, key factors are who's at the table, and is it equitable, and what is their level of input. I think another concern that continues to be in some jurisdiction is just somewhat of a monopolistic view of utility roles. And so I think that has to be tempered with, like I said, kind of what that state policy is against, what utilities are proposing. In Wisconsin, the utility company there actually proposed on its own a similar pilot program with a focus on low to moderate income communities. Interestingly, this is not anything that's pursuant to legislative mandate. It wasn't anything that was mandated by the commission. And so I think my takeaway is that you are seeing utilities out there actively pursuing equity focused initiatives in the electrification space with or without legislative mandates. And then lastly, I just want to highlight Nevada. They recently opened up their new transportation electrification program plan reviewing the utilities. There is legislative mandates, very similar to Illinois. And in fact, very similarly also mandates that they invest in everything from transits and fleets in historically underserved communities. The bare minimum percentage of that spend is 40%. According to that filing, this particular utility, they will achieve in a little bit over 50% of those investments will be in historically underserved communities. And so I'll stop there, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of commissions that are out there seeing what that utility role looks like. And so I'm happy to take questions after this. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was a fantastic overview, Maria. I know you mentioned you can post a few links in the chat. I'm sure folks would love to be able to link out to some of the reports and the legislation that you've been discussing. So that would be great.
Happy to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right. Well, we'll see you in just a few more minutes after we hear from our other two panelists. Next up is Ken Patrick, who is a senior manager of electrification and innovation at Ameren. In this role, Ken leverages his 20 plus years of professional experience to lead Ameren's efforts to develop strategies and policies for efficient electrification programs that benefit customers, the environment, and the company. Ken earned a Bachelor's of Science degree in electrical engineering from the University of Missouri-Rolla and a master's degree in business administration from the Keller Graduate School of Management. Ken is also a graduate certificate in project management and is an accredited project management professional by the Project Management Institute. All right, and with that, I am going to turn it over to you, Ken.
Thanks for the introduction, and thanks to Commissioner Bocanegra for your opener as well. When I looking at this session, the role that the utilities play. When I look at what that as our topic, one of the things that I want to do is just kind of take a step back and look at the strategy that we have at Ameren. So I'm going to share my screen here. When we think of transportation electrification, it's really embedded in what we do at Ameren, starting all the way from our vision statement, which is leading the way to a sustainable energy future. And I'll focus on that word sustainable or sustainability. When we think about sustainability, we think about meeting the needs of today without compromising the needs of the future. When you hear people talk about sustainability, you also hear the term ESG, which stands for environmental, social, and governance. From an environmental standpoint, one thing I can share with everyone on the call, last year, Ameren announced a plan where we as a company are committed to a net zero carbon emissions across our company by 2050. And another thing that I'm sure most on the call are aware of, from an environmental standpoint, transportation causes almost 1/3 of all U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. So transportation electrification is a way to reduce those emissions. So when we think about sustainability and ESG, the environmental part of that, the E, we know transportation is a way to address this portion of our vision. The other portion, S, social. So when you say ESG, S, the social impact, normally when people think of ESG, the E is getting a lot of attention, environmental. But in 2020, COVID-19 put the S in ESG firmly at the center of our discussions. And one of the things that you will see is a lot of companies are intensifying their efforts to manage health and safety, address diversity and inclusion, and engage with communities. From a social impact, studies have found increased rates of COVID in areas of elevated air pollution. Underserved communities are disproportionately exposed to elevated air pollution. And again, transportation electrification is a way that we could put people at the center of what we're doing. So that's the S of ESG. The G, which stands for governance. One of the things that Commissioner Bocanegra pointed out was the board of directors. That's part of our governance and making sure that we have a diverse board of directors. Ameren's board of directors is very diverse. The other thing that we look at as far as the G is making sure that we have the right programs and policies in place. So if you look at our strategy, which is kind of in the upper right-hand corner of this chart, you'll see that enhance regulatory framework and advocate for responsible policies. So we want to make sure that we have the right policies in place as well. So looking at that, our vision, sustainable, ESG, electrification is embedded within that. The other thing that I'll mention is another thing that's circled on this chart are our values. Again, Commissioner Bocanegra mentioned DE&I, diversity, equity, and inclusion a lot in her opener. I just want to share that DE&I is one of Ameren's core values. And when we look at electrification transportation, we look at it through a DE&I lens. So diversity. Ameren has a very diverse customer base. We serve a large portion of Illinois and Missouri, 64,000 square miles to be precise. We have 2.4 million electric customers. And we want to make sure that the benefits of electrification are accessible to all our customers, all our communities. So that's diversity. From an equity standpoint, underserved communities are often hit first and worst by the impacts of climate change. As a new technology, electric vehicles have the potential to vastly improve the health, well-being, and well-being of our communities. Unfortunately, as with many new technologies, it is often the most affluent, it's often only the most affluent of our communities that experience these benefits first. So we're focused on eliminating the barriers to bring the benefits of electrification to all customers. Again, this is all, it's in our values. And the last part of D&I is the I, the inclusion. And this is a part that, I'm very, very passionate about, very focused on. And from an inclusion, it's authentically bringing traditionally excluded individuals and our groups into processes, activities, and decision-making up front prior to a solution being fully baked. So in addition to the efforts that Ameren is doing daily to reach out with our communities, bring them to the table, we're very intentional about this inclusion portion. We've reached out to experts in the industry, EV which is hosting this conference. We have a landscape analysis that we're working with EV and part of that analysis is identifying the frontline communities in our service territory. Those communities hit first and worst by the impacts of climate change, and understanding their awareness and attitudes towards clean transportation options. Doing this up front so we can ensure that we're putting the right solutions, have the right policies to address those communities. Walker Miller, another one of the experts in the industry that we're partnering with. And we have ongoing right now an inclusion and outreach effort with them. So it's determining the best way to reach these communities. So that entails getting a better understanding of the capabilities, the capacities, and the limitations. So when we have these opportunities, making sure that we're reaching out, and bringing these communities in a way that we're making sure we're making proper contact for them to take advantage of those opportunities. I guess I can pause here. I mean, I kind of hit on our vision, you know, our value of DE and I being embedded, our strategy, customer affordability. I mean, as we increase electrification, it allows us to optimize the grid. So putting downward rate pressure for all of our customers, making electricity affordable. With that, I'll wait for questions in the chat, or for Kelly for you to tee me off. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Yeah, we've got a lot of great questions coming in the Q&A already. So thanks, everyone. Please do keep those coming. Let's go ahead and wrap up the panel from Jacqueline. So Jacqueline, if you would like to go ahead and if you're able to turn your camera on, great. If not, you can just unmute, and we'd love to hear a bit about you, but I'll give a short introduction as well. So Jacqueline Badeo is a South Central Los Angeles native with down South and Nigerian roots. She served as a longtime social and environmental activist, City of Los Angeles elected official for 7 years, California State Assembly Women's Commissioner, and is very committed to organizational and environmental issues on a global scale. I will go ahead and turn it over to you, Jacqueline. You can unmute.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to the team. We're here. I want to welcome everyone for the E-Mobility, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Connections to Grid panel. And so we've heard a lot of things that's been going on from the previous speakers, and they kind of highlight the actions that we have to take in order to reach our goals for zero emissions, most definitely in the state of California. But what I would like to do is begin by kind of just throwing some things out there, right? Especially in terms of equity. We have communities who suffer, disadvantaged communities who suffer from, no bandwidth, just poor technology. So while we have this pressing timeline, how do we create a new culture for the people to make sure that they comply? But most definitely, we talk about the smart grid and smart citizens. So how do we create a smart grid and smart citizens? So, with the grid is, by definition, it's a electricity supply network that uses the digital communications technology to detect and pretty much react to local change. And so what we are talking about is a change. And in order for us to all be effective, we have to kind of question ourselves and determine what are the proper changes that we have to take, what are the methods that we need to implement in order for us to all be successful. And so as smart citizens, that's kind of what we're going for, where we have connected, the benefits of electric vehicles. We have many health disparities, and we have just so many environmental issues happening. But when it comes to actualizing and bringing this one goal to fruition, most definitely, and the advocacy is many levels to it now. So I would just like to speak quickly about Watts Clean Air and Energy Committee. So we are a grassroots organization, and we serve as the environmental arm for a nonprofit Watts Conda, which is an environmental scope on how to really reach ecology and biodiversity. And transportation is one of the T's in Watts Conda. So we've been serving these communities because we believe that ecology and biodiversity is the way, but the how is always the question. And so our main focus is to ensure that disadvantaged communities are not left behind in the green burgeoning industry lifestyle as well. And so for sure, all of our programming, it supports that effort, because the reality is, as the infrastructure and the social systems and the directives are changing, how are we going to encourage the people to not get left behind and to also contribute in this process, so we can really design systems of learning and implementation that really works? For instance, like Lacey's program, I recently participated with a movement for SB 551. Unfortunately, that did not pass, and that was for us to have a zero emissions vehicle authority. But that's the reality, right? We have directives, but when it comes down to the policy, how do we connect all of the pieces? And so now we're still working, gearing up to make sure that this move is inclusive, diverse, and is deeply rooted with equity. For sure, when it comes to the health disparities and processes, right? We have become co-leads for the AB 617 South LA Steering Committee. And in that role, our goal is to not just only advocate, because sometimes we get caught in advocating, is to, come up with solutions and implement those solutions and make sure that we're making the proper adjustments as we go along. And with that, there also are incentives that comes from the state of California that we make sure to include the community on, to make sure they're at the table. We advocated for all the disadvantaged communities who at the time we felt were being left out, little pocket communities. And so we have the largest steering committee out of all 17. And it hasn't been the easiest road, but I believe where that takes us to is the reality of the capacity building and leadership development that's needed for this movement. Oftentimes it can be a little uncomfortable working, community and government together, because, sometimes it's different objectives or goals, or it's the same, but from a different perspective. And you have to try to figure out how to make everything work in this melting pot that we live in, right? And so with that, we have had a success, and the deadline for our community's emissions reductions plan and our air monitoring plan have been extended. And this is something that the people of California most definitely have been pushing for, and I feel will be an aid in order to really design sustainable systems that are equitable, diverse, and inclusive relative to EVs. And so we also participated, that's the thing, the things that stick out to me.
Sounds like we may have lost Jacqueline. Well, hopefully she'll be able to join. Jacqueline, maybe try refreshing or cutting your video to jump back in. While we wait for Jacqueline to rejoin us, I'll invite Ken and Maria to turn their video back on, and perhaps we can move into some of the questions that have come in the Q&A. And please do continue to ask others as they're coming up for you. And yeah, I guess hopefully Jacqueline will be rejoining soon. But thank you for those opening remarks from Jacqueline. Okay, I'm going to start us off with a question for perhaps perhaps both of you. And I think, Maria, you did address this a little bit in the chat already, but we use phrases like equity and underserved communities a lot in our work, and certainly throughout this conference we are. And I'm curious, from the utilities perspective, are you seeing any trends, or maybe at Ameren, how do you define underserved communities? And I guess, yeah, whoever wants to answer that first. Maria, perhaps?
I'll just start, and I'll give you the regulatory perspective, I guess, and then, I'm sure Ken can talk utility. But I think to be clear, Illinois, I think, has some definitions that are very, very specific in the new legislation. But I think that there certainly are states. I think the person that asked the question is, how do we define it? And I, was mentioning, I think that in the absence of an actual legislative definition, there are some potential solutions out there. If you're in a jurisdiction that maybe it's a little unclear, or just kind of maybe first impression hasn't really been addressed in this context. One example that comes to my mind is, before this legislation, Illinois had very specific, and we still do have very specific definitions under our Illinois Solar for All program. That is largely defined by a census tract with the federal government. So that's one area you can borrow, if you will, from other existing programs, whether it be net metering, solar, et cetera, in those jurisdictions. That might be helpful. The other thing that I've noticed, and it keeps bearing itself out in not just in the electrification context, but just in general, stakeholder engagement before something gets docketed is key. The more voices you have to help you define that and come up with a comparable solution, that's key too. And so I'll just leave it there, and I'll see what Ameren thinks.
Yeah, my thoughts are very consistent with Commissioner Bocanegra. And one of the things I mentioned in the opener is that we have a landscape analysis that's currently going on with EV Noir, and that's to help to define what we're calling frontline communities in our service territory, and those communities that are hit first and worst by the impacts of climate change. And we're and they're the experts, so it's knowing to reach out to experts. But the way that we're looking at it, we're not only relying on measures of diversity and income. In addition to that, we're using other factors, particulate matter, exposure to transportation emissions, ozone levels, exposure to toxins, and others. And we're looking at that throughout our service territory, down to the zip code level. And that will help us, in our service territory, know where to focus. So when we're looking at a program, and the next part of that landscape analysis is, once we've identified those frontline communities, is engaging with them. So again, part of the effort we have with EV Noir is going out. Now we've identified, prioritized the frontline communities within our service territory, reaching out to them. And I think one of the items in one of the questions in the chat may have been, just about vehicle ownership. Part of this engagement, we'll find it, some of these communities, the transportation that they're using, maybe it isn't vehicle owned. Maybe, are they using or buses? Are they using car share? So that's the kind of information that we're gathering from this analysis. I'll stop there. I have a lot more I could say, but we're using that data to go forward with pilots to implement it. So it's being prepared to use that information to make an impact. I think Commissioner Bocanegra, you might have said beneficial. We don't want to just throw something out there. We want to make sure it's beneficial for the communities, and that outreach is key. Hopefully that answered, but please let me know.
Yeah, thank you both. I want to maybe dig into that and ask a follow-up question, and would love to hear from Jacqueline on this one as well. This idea of not just throwing chargers into a community and hoping that suddenly they are utilized 100%, or that they don't have some unintended consequences. Can you speak to what your experience has been in rolling out infrastructure in areas that haven't had any infrastructure in them before? What are some of the challenges that you're facing? What are you hearing from community-based organizations that you might be reaching out to help guide how you're making those investments and where exactly they're placed? And also, what's the process around placing those investments? And maybe I'll start with you, Ken, because that was a follow-up, but I'd love to hear from Jacqueline as well.
Okay.
Okay. Yes, awesome. No, great question. And Watts, we were lucky enough to receive the TCC grant I mentioned earlier. And within that grant, we had 17 chargers embedded. And the reality is the infrastructure, as I always tell people, once you crack open the infrastructure, you never know what you're going to run into. For instance, I've been having technical difficulties today. That's because we have poor bandwidth in the community. And so the major project where it was going to be located, what it looks like in terms of implementation is that the reality is the structure, the grid is not there. And so then it becomes a 2-year process because you have to upgrade the grid. And also just doing, community science, going to people, seeing what the issues are, or see who's driving the electric vehicles in the community, promoting the programs, and those who don't qualify for those programs, seeing where the best locations will actually be. Because one of the failures we did initially, and this was because it didn't involve community input. Say, for instance, you have a EV charger at an alley, but there's no regulation on who can actually park at that EV charger. Most of the time, it's someone who's in a regular vehicle. And so it's just so many things that you have to consider, but most definitely working with the governmental entities, that helps a lot. When you have different initiatives coming down the pipeline. And so I encourage everyone to keep your eyes open and to get with groups. And the only way we can really get it done is together. Thank you.
Thanks, Jacqueline. Anything you want to add to that, Ken? Or respond to the question otherwise?
No, and if you could just repeat what the initial was, I may add to some of what Ameren is doing.
Sure. Yeah. So I guess sort of the heart of my question was around how are you ensuring that the investments that you're making, whether it's an infrastructure or maybe an incentive program, or maybe it's a pilot program, are being distributed into the communities that you are seeing that need is happening, and what's the process for implementation?
Okay, and I will say that goes back to the the I and DE and I, the inclusion portion. So it's reaching out and understanding the needs of the community. So that's part of it. And I mean, I can give some examples, some pilot examples, and I know that you're aware of some of the pilots that we're doing, because we've actually have partnered with Fourth. One of the efforts that we've done is the Silvers program, which stands for St. Louis vehicles and rides for seniors. And again, this is reaching directly to the community, seeing what they have a need for. So we reached out to this was also another partner was the city of St. Louis and the St. Louis area of aging. And we went to their facilities, and you can see the need. One of the needs that they have at these community-based organizations that we went to, they were providing services to seniors, but they were providing them in, for rides that seniors needed, and also for food delivery, for meal delivery. But the way they were accomplishing that were in older ICE vehicles, costly maintenance. So as a pilot, what we did, meeting their needs, meeting the community needs, reaching out to them, understanding what they needed. We now have some charging stations in place, and teaming with General Motors as well, some vehicles that these communities-based organizations are using to still meet that overall goal of serving the community. So it's going directly and helping the community. So I mean, it's several benefits on that. I mean, I think most of us on this call know the benefits of electric vehicles, but I mean, it's the environmental portion that I mentioned, but it's a cost too. So those older vehicles are more costly. So for the maintenance of them, the fueling of them. So if we can save these organizations funding, they'll be empowered to do even more. So these are pilots that we're doing. Something that we're doing as part of this pilot is collecting data because I mean, we're starting with these two community-based organizations, but we want to understand how can we spread that out to others. So it's again, reaching out, understanding the need, and putting a solution in place that meets that need, not just throwing, charging stations out there. I'm sure that, the majority of the people that are benefiting from this program, likely are not, car owners, but, we're positioning where they can still take advantage of transportation electrification. That's one example.
Yeah, thanks for that example, Ken. I appreciate that. And it highlights the importance, and I think each of you have mentioned this already, is the importance of that stakeholder outreach and engagement before any real decisions or investments or funding is sought. So I just want to highlight and echo that that really important piece. So thank you all for doing that so far. Shifting gears a little bit, and I want to maybe direct this one to Maria first. If you'd like to respond, but there's a question in the chat that is, why should utilities be allowed to spend ratepayer funds on this infrastructure, this being EV infrastructure, I'm assuming? Do you have a framework for evaluating the trade-off between rate increases from funding EVs versus the climate benefits that might result?
Yeah, I mean, that certainly is a fair question. I think it's a question that continues to be controversial, with certain jurisdictions. I think really it comes down to, at least in our case, it really is the policy decision of our state. Illinois happens to be one that, we did grapple with this for quite a long time, to be quite honest. I memean, the product that you see that was just passed 2 months ago is the result of at least 2 years of back and forth. And to her point, addressing some of those really, really tough, sensitive questions, what exactly is the role of the utility? And, for Illinois, there is a greater role, and for better, for worse, that does mean looking at using ratepayer funds. However, at least in our law, there is mandates to look at how you can minimize rate impact. In fact, there's also rate cap increases with respect to a lot of these EV type programs. And just so we're clear, at least in Illinois, the utilities are not being asked to subsidize through ratepayer funds EVs themselves. I think this is really centered on things like rebates for charging infrastructure, and sometimes perhaps maybe a rebate for incentive, as an incentive to enroll in a particular time of use rate. But as far as, figuring out what that delta looks like, I think that goes back to the metrics. But, for us, that measurement of what that cost really is, it's not just in our electrification plans, but it's going to show up in our performance-based rate making mandates and mechanisms, as well as our integrated distribution planning. And so those things will look at everything from avoided costs and into some of those benefits might look like. But I hope that answers the first part. Is at least with the EV programs, there will be a rate cap.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. Any of the other panelists want to add anything to that? Otherwise, we can move on to another question. Okay, I'll take that as a no. So there have been a few questions and a theme in the chat about, and Ken, you've already alluded to this a little bit as well, but about programs that don't involve car ownership. And so some questions specifically around what's your experience with any sort of medium and heavy duty electrification? Are you doing anything around school buses or transit buses? But then also more recently, a question popped in the chat around promoting micromobility options such as electric bikes and scooters. So I'd love to hear maybe perhaps everyone's perspectives on that. What are you seeing, and what are you personally working toward at your organization?
Okay, and I'll start with buses. And Commissioner Bocanegra has already spoke about, some of the bus efforts that we currently have going on in Ameren, Illinois, which has to do with, school buses. And we have, in a couple of our school districts, electric buses there. The other thing I'll say about buses is we also are partnering with Bi-State, which for in St. Louis, that's the bus company that for transit, and they are electrifying 20 of their buses. And from the utility standpoint, we're making sure that the infrastructure is in place to support that electrification of their fleet. So, I mean, we've built a substation to support electrification for bus riding. So, I mean, those are a couple of examples of what we're doing for those, non-car ownership examples. I shared the Silvers program as an example. But the other thing, I just go back to inclusion again. So before even going out and doing some of these items, one of the things that we're doing is studies. So we're, and part of my title is, I'm Senior Manager, Electrification and Innovation. So part of the innovation portion of that is looking at technologies, looking at upfront what is required to put some of, to electrify. So we're partnering with school districts, looking at the routes that they're currently taking, kind of educating, it's kind of the outreach education, letting them know how they could benefit. Is it the right time to, convert their fleet? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but we want to educate them so that they can be in position to make that determination. So when that threshold is met, we could transfer over. So, I mean, Hazelwood School District is one that we're partnering with that upfront effort. And the last thing, and I'll end with one that I think I can say it, but I'll end with one that you're likely aware of. I mean, we're partnering with Fourth again for an affordable housing car share effort. So we're another pilot where we can want to learn by putting charging stations, offering vehicles in affordable housing complexes. So those are some, additional irons we have in the fire, or current efforts that we have going on. The thing that we haven't been as focused on, and maybe this will come out of, the EVNOR effort or other landscape analysis that we're doing, is some of those other forms of transportation. But I just kind of shared what we've focused on thus far.
Thanks, Ken. Jacqueline, do you have anything to add? What sort of projects are you getting into outside of the, or at least acknowledging that there are a lot of transportation and mobility needs outside of personal car ownership?
Yes, most definitely. So for Watts, we have electrified the local Dash bus line. That was a victory. We also have car share programs going on, ride share programs. A lot of this is coming from the TCC grant. Wanted to make sure that what the community said it needed was provided. And most definitely, as Mr. Patrick just mentioned, we have to look at this from a comprehensive scope. And so the housing most definitely is an important part, especially as different cities are becoming more, they're having more land use changes. So we have to make sure that everything is provided. Been reaching barriers where now even a lot of housing, a lot of parking is now required. And so just trying to make sure that we accommodate the people. And as far as like for businesses, that's a population that we definitely work with. One, to see if they're interested in hosting chargers at their site, because that also funnels into the communication flow, where you have people who deliver. We have the e-bikes with the trailers people can deliver. And so encouraging people to become entrepreneurs with these type of businesses, that's something that we take pride in. Getting them from low riders to EVs, changing the culture, and making sure the proper education is there, connecting with partners who have the opportunities for the community to be educated on how to even do the installations, making sure that the community not only receives all of the goods, but they're also able to participate. And everything, we're working on a few more things. People are now using vehicles to monitor the air, right? And so just pushing forward these different types of programs where we can also collect more data and continue to build as the changes come through. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. All right, so we have just a few more minutes, and I want to ask one more question for each of our panelists to respond to. And some of you have alluded to the importance of partnerships already, and Jacqueline, you were just speaking about that a little bit. I'm curious for each of you to share, a highlight or a success story of yours that has resulted from partnering with a local organization or entity around, where the service territories that you engage with. So can you give us, I guess just leave us on a positive note of something that you want to share as a success.
This is Maria. I'll start first by saying, our agency obviously doesn't traditionally work with utilities in that way, but this is related, but it is something I think worth mentioning, and that is, I was able to connect a couple of years ago, Northwestern's new Master's in Sustainability and Environmental Studies, I believe is the name of the program. I was able to connect them with some folks at the City of Chicago. The students were looking for sort of a mock project to work on, and it actually ended up working out. They did some, charging station planning with the City of Chicago. I'm sure if you follow them on LinkedIn, there's some articles there about what that progress looks like. But I think that's just one example of partnering together, utilities, cities, and of course, a university.
Would you like to go next, Jacqueline?
Sure. A victory in this movement for me, most definitely. And earlier this year in January, my organization was able to participate in a national campaign for electrification for all, electric vehicles for all, VLOs. And I feel really good about that because not only was it able to reach people locally, but also on a national level. It's hard to educate people. And when they see a person that, is from the community and advocates for a day-to-day, it gives hope or belief in what we're talking about. They're like, oh, this is something that's really real. And, oh, maybe I should get an electric vehicle. So many inquiries have come in for people. And so we make sure that from there, we provide the technical assistance to get people into the vehicle. So communication is the major part and is key. And so I would like to leave off with that. Thank you.
All right, I guess, and I know we're about out of time, so I'll make this very brief. And I think I've already actually shared multiple examples that I believe are have been examples of reaching out. That's always number one, and actually being able to put solutions in place, whether with a pilot like the Silvers program that's in North St. Louis, in an area. These charging stations, it was a charging station desert. If you look at the map of North St. Louis, there were no charging stations there, no visibility, likely to a lot of the community on electrification. So I'm very proud of that. And I consider myself part of the community. My parents grew up in these areas. So we're serving the community. I'm part of the community, so I'm happy about that. The bus with Bi-State, the buses and with the schools, all of those things. And we're not done. Got a lot of work to do. So I'm looking forward to continuing.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. We are over time, and I know everyone's probably eager to get to the next event. Thank you all for your great perspectives and insights today in this wonderful conversation. And thanks everyone for joining and bearing with us as we navigated a few technical challenges, but definitely glad to have Maria and Jacqueline and Ken join us today. And with that, I'll let you all go and enjoy the rest of the conference.